Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. It's a privilege to be among friends and in such an illustrious company to discuss the Cybersecurity Act and overall the issue of resilience and cybersecurity in the European Union. From my perspective, I'd like to do really three things. Keep it simple. Three things. Explain what the Symantec position is on this issue. Try to describe as well what, from my perspective, the overall industry consensus is in some of these issues that we are touching today. And also share some personal thoughts as to the goals towards which I think we need to be striving. So, we're expected to discuss about security, but really the elephant in the room is the Cybersecurity Act. So rather than beating around the bush, I'll focus immediately on the Cybersecurity Act and, make your time towards the main course perhaps shorter and easier. One advantage, if you like, from my perspective is that having been for 18 years in Brussels responsible for cybersecurity, either in the institutions or in the industry, you get a perspective as to how cybersecurity used to be and how cybersecurity is now. And I can tell you there's a very big change. When I was in the Commission, when I started at Symantec, cybersecurity was a nice to have. Now, every second day of the week, there is something on cybersecurity. And sometimes I get to speak on it and people get bored listening to me explaining about this cyber attack or the other cyber attack. So there's definitely a very big change. There's definitely a very big change, and to that end, I think we need to be recognizing and congratulating the Commission for taking some very, very important steps, either in the form of the NIS directive or in the form of the GDPR, which is indeed the flavor of the day when I'm talking to my customers in anything that has to do with cybersecurity. And on top of that also, for bringing forward an ambitious proposal for ENISA, and a proposal also which aims at leveling access and inequalities that exist right now in the European market. So I think it's important that we congratulate the Commission for doing a step in the right direction to address market access, harmonization through certification. At the same time, I think it's very important to look ourselves in the mirror and be very transparent about something. I've heard on more than one occasion industry partners saying that cybersecurity certification, great, an amazing opportunity to replace NIS, or even better, get an NIS version 2. I'm really sorry, and I will be very blunt about this. If we want baseline security legislation, then we should be asking for it. And, we're at the European Parliament, the Commission has the right of initiative. They have, as we say in Greek, they have the knife and the melon, and they get to decide how they'd like to slice it. So they should be proposing cybersecurity baseline legislation, and we're here to come again and discuss whether we like it or not, and what we think about it. But the certification legislation is not a version 2 of the NIS. Frankly, the certification legislation and anything that has to do with certification is about how you adjust the technical properties of a particular technology, a product, a service, to meet the baseline requirements that any law is setting. To say that we're going to use cybersecurity certification as an instrument to achieve an NIS version 2 is the equivalent of saying I'm going to build a house starting from the roof. Okay? So I want to be very transparent on that in terms of what the industry may hope or should hope about this topic. Now, on that understanding, if we look at the different elements of the Cybersecurity Act, ENISA, ladies and gentlemen, I've had the privilege of being a regular member of the permanent stakeholders group of the European Network and Information Security Agency. I've spent a good deal of my time on ENISA, and I can attest with a high degree of confidence that ENISA works. ENISA is a good agency, and we should be happy that we have that in Europe. So, on that understanding, from my perspective and from everything I've heard from my industry colleagues, the discussion about the ENISA mandate from an industry standpoint is the least controversial topic. We want a functioning ENISA. We want ENISA with a strong mandate. We want an effective agency that is able to help the member states in their mission. And we also want an agency that is able to fit and to how to put it, to, if you like, instill reality, the cybersecurity reality, the operational needs of cybersecurity in the policy making that is happening in Brussels. I'll call out a person in the room. The Deputy DPS is in the room, and it's great that he's here today. I look at an EDPS as an example of the kind of instilling data protection reality into the policies of the European Union as a body that is being consulted, as a body which is actually active and is giving ideas on how privacy and data protection needs to play a key role in EU policies at the Parliament and in other groups, in other organizations, institutions, I should say. Can we have ENISA doing something similar? Can we have ENISA being as influential? And equally, I would argue that can ENISA help the data protection authorities when the data protection authorities are developing policies in compliance with GDPR that touch on cybersecurity. I sometimes think of cybersecurity like gravity. It's not always very pleasant, especially not if you're in an aeroplane, but it's certainly there and it's certainly necessary, and you've got to deal with it. So as we're developing the different cybersecurity policies in data protection, breach notification, Article 32, 33 in GDPR, can we make sure that also ENISA has a role to play in helping, educating policymakers, authorities on the direction that we need to take? On certification, and which most other speakers actually spend most of their time on, we need to begin with something, again, I'll try to break this down into something very, very simple. We want certification to succeed. I cannot stress it strongly enough. We want this to work. Why? Because it's in our interest. We want this to work because if it works, we are able to do business in Europe more effectively. And European companies, which we want to do business with, are able to grow more effectively. We are a company that's selling and exporting out of Europe. It is in our interest to have the possibility to continue to do that, to grow our investment in Europe, and on top of that, to be able to operate in the European environment in this way. So, the success of the certification scheme will be dependent on three conditions: governance, simplicity versus complexity, and the market dimension. Let me explain this again, these three conditions, very, very simply. Governance. Failure or success, make no mistake about it, will be on how the governance, how the process from where you start the certification scheme to how a certification scheme becomes official is going to be adopted. So in that sense, the concern among the industry, and again, that's a unanimous concern, that's not just Symantec, is the fact that if member states have a very strong control over this process, a process that's designed to be, first and foremost, necessary to meet a market need, a technical process, becomes a political debate. So there will be negotiation from the member states, and we need to make sure that we have a process in place that will allow for the other stakeholders to express their views and express and share as well the market reality and the concerns that they're being facing. Participation of industry and other stakeholders will actually facilitate the development of schemes that are reflective of the reality of the market and of the market needs. Simplicity versus complexity. the simplicity aspect is going to be, in my opinion, an important success factor because it will determine things like how quickly are we able to reach consensus on a particular certification scheme. There's been industry that's been calling for a certification scheme that's focused on IoT. There's been industry that's been calling for certification schemes that are focused on consumer. There's been industry that's been calling for certification focused on industrial IoT. There are ideas about combination of both. We heard Ms. Niebler talking also about the idea of involving processes as well. I'm sympathetic to a number of those arguments. Surely I can see the argument about consumer IoT. It's an argument that we've made as well. Surely I can see the argument for industrial IoT because we see cyber attacks happening there too. Overall, I think there is consensus that IoT certainly needs to be a priority. We need to figure out how exactly we want the system to be tested, where we want to focus and how we want to try. The challenge with going down the path of beyond the basic certification level, the challenge of going to the high and the substantial, is challenges actually that I think Ms. Niebler alluded to. We're going to be confronted with questions like voluntary or obligatory. We're going to be confronted with questions like, national security because it's critical infrastructure. We're going to be confronted with questions along the lines of other power brokers in the negotiation that will want to exercise influence. So my concern is, how quickly will we be able, what risk are we putting into the certification system? How quickly will we be able to push a process and an amount of certificates that will eventually show that the system is working and the system is successful? Last area, market dimension. Assuming that the regime would be more or less a voluntary one, we heard that that will not necessarily be the case, that there might be also an obligatory component to it. Assuming, let's say, that we touch for a moment on the voluntary one, the success of the regime will very much depend on the ability of the system to attract support from European players and to get also support from players, small and medium enterprises, organizations that would benefit from the certification scheme. How would they do that? They would do that if they're able to meet two objectives. They're able to sell inside the European market, sell effectively inside the European market because the barriers are being removed, and they're using that as a leverage to sell externally. So utilize the standards that exist in Europe in order for them to grow from the domestic market and expand outside. The best way to do that is by not just building European standards, but by also leveraging international standards that exist in order for organizations to see the value of the certification in terms of capturing market in Europe and then growing from that market outside to the rest of Europe, to the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we are confronted with an important task and an important challenge ahead of us. I think that the fact that we're discussing about cybersecurity is healthy. The fact that we're doing this debate is in the right direction. I will tell you that I have no doubt in my mind that I'm certainly in the right industry, because for the next 10 years or so, we'll continue to be busy with cybersecurity because of everything being connected. My objective, my personal objective, if you like, is that I've got 3 sons who they will have to have a job one day in Europe, actually some of them one day fairly soon. So from my end, I want a functional system because, if you like, again, very personally, I want a functional system because that system will ensure growth of the European market and ultimately jobs and economic growth for them, which is what they need for them to stay, and as opposed to they have to emigrate to Singapore, which is a lovely place but a bit far from mom and dad. Thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.